An end to war and slavery. Emancipation Proclamation. The Civil War had been raging for more than a year when President Abraham Lincoln issued a special order called the Emancipation Proclamation. This order helped put an end to most slavery in the United States about 250 years after organized slavery began. It allowed slaves in some states to join the army and fight in the Civil War, which helped guarantee freedom for all. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't make slavery completely illegal. That didn't happen until 1865, when the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Some of the signers of the Constitution actually owned slaves, while others believed slavery was wrong. But the signers knew the Constitution wasn't perfect. That's what amendments like the 13th are for, to fix or improve our rules. This amendment officially abolished slavery and indentured servitude in our country. A day to remember. For slaves in Texas, June 19, 1865 is a day to remember. This is the day Gordon Granger, a general in the Union Army, announced in Texas that the war was over and the slaves were free. This message took almost 6 weeks to reach all Texas slaves and their former owners. 1 year later, on June 19, 1866, former Texas slaves gathered to celebrate their new lives. They sang songs, gave speeches, and talked about how thankful they were for their freedom. This day is still special to Texans. Each year, people from all cultures gather to celebrate Juneteenth. Families enjoyed parades, picnics, and speeches. It is especially a time for citizens to discuss progress and difficulties for African Americans. Life in Texas after slavery. African Americans were joyful when they heard the news of their freedom. However, they faced many new challenges with their freedom. Life was hard. Most ex-slaves in Texas had no education. They had never been allowed to attend school. Most did not read or write. It was difficult for them to find jobs. Former slaves had to worry about where they would live. Some of these people decided to stay with their former owners. Now they worked for money. Some farmed on their owner's land and shared the money they made. Others headed north, hoping to find a better way of life in a new place. There were still many people who did not believe the slaves should be free. Many public places were still divided by color. Life would be difficult for many years to come. Reconstruction in Texas. The period of time after the Civil War is known as Reconstruction. It lasted more than 10 years. During this time, people had to rebuild the South. They also had to rebuild their own lives. Former slaves had to find jobs and homes. Former landowners had to find ways to run their farms and plantations without slave labor. Many Anglo-Americans had to rebuild homes and farms. People had to deal with the deaths or injuries of fathers, husbands, and sons who fought in the war. There was still a lot of anger between North and South. Sometimes this anger led to violence against the newly freed African Americans. The United States government decided to set up a special unit to help the newly freed people. In 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau helped African Americans find jobs and homes. They also established about 150 schools in Texas. These schools were for African American children and adults. Texas rejoins the Union. Many of the wounds from the war began to heal. The most difficult things to heal were people's feelings. The Confederacy had lost the war, but leaders on both sides knew the best thing was to put the United States back together again. On March 30th, 1870, Texas once again joined the United States of America. Edmund Davis became the new governor. He was not very popular. People thought he spent too much money. They also thought he gave too much help to African Americans. Eventually, in 1876, the state adopted and signed a new constitution. Now, the Texas government and other state leaders had much less power than they had before.